Judy Ganes, welcome to the Map It Forward podcast and the Love and Other Delusions podcast. We are so grateful to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
Before we get started, tell everybody what you do.
Well, today is called the Nostradamus of coffee. So the Nostradamus of coffee. What I've done for the past 38 years is act as a market analyst, covering the market fundamentals for the topical soft commodities. So coffee, but in addition to that, cocoa and sugar and cotton and orange juice. And so I'm very astute of what's happening on a global basis and any actions that would influence the price. And then I also, based on that, try and forecast the price.
Amazing. So the people who are going to be watching this podcast or listening to this podcast are people in the coffee industry, but also the general public through the Love and Other Delusions podcast. And the reason we want to do that is because in the coffee industry, we've been talking a long time about the crises, the various different crises across the coffee value chain, both from the consuming end as well as from the producing end. But we seem to be talking about that in amongst the coffee industry and not really taking the discussion to the general public. So this is an episode in a series, one with Jonas Fijareso, one with Alejandro Cadena, the CEO from Caravella, and now with you. So this is a discussion for everyone that's listening. This is a discussion about pricing and about markets and about what's happening in Brazil and how that's going to potentially influence the way we operate in the industry, as well as the way that consumers are going to be able to engage with coffee. So we have the Nostradamus of coffee with us. So
we could have that nickname. You know, it was just someone who was being a little humorous.
It was very
today.
cute, but
you know.
So I was looking at the price of coffee before we jumped on, and it closed at 184 today. And so it's starting to rally-ish over the last week after it had a much bigger jump in July. Can we talk to people about, let's start with talking about the price of coffee, then we'll go to talking about yield. So talk to us about how coffee prices are determined.
Okay, so coffee prices are determined in the cash in the market, the physical market. The exchange, the New York Exchange for Arabica coffee and the Robusta price traded in London is a benchmark, and the exchange is used as price discovery, and it represents a standardized contract. But in the real world, in the physical world, coffee trades at discounts and premiums to the base grade in the New York futures contract. And in other commodities, that's called the basis. Cash minus futures, get that difference, is called the basis. And in coffee, you might hear someone talk about the differential. And it's the exact same thing. The basis is the differential. And that distinguishes the price between the general New York contract, which is 37,500 pounds of coffee. And a bag of coffee is 132 pounds, 60 kilo bag, just for reference.
It's about a container for anyone looking to understand. It's sort of a container.
Okay. And just as a point of reference, a 1 cent move in coffee. So if the market went from 184 to 185, represents in dollar terms $375 US dollars.
And over the past month, we've been seeing quite large fluctuations in that, right?
So we've seen more volatility in the market than we've seen in a number of years. But I mean, I can date myself because I've been covering this for 38 years. And so, you know, I'm hitting 60. And so I was around for the 1985 drought and the 1994 frost. And, you know, I've seen this market at 318 and I've seen it, you know, touching 40 cents. So I've seen all the extremes. I've seen the cycles. We've been through this before.
can we get this out of the way right up front for all the coffee bros out there that claim that the market is being driven by fake news to drive the prices of coffee up? What do you have to say to that?
The market actually knows best. Okay. I mean, when you talk about a market, and the market is supposed to be absorbing all the fundamentals. And sometimes what happens is people don't want to believe the market fundamentals, or they don't understand them, or they're missing certain pieces and things are out of context. And so they're not looking at the complete picture. And so that's where I step in, is because I have to be like the eyes of the market and watch everything. And it's very easy when something dramatic happens to kind of slough it off and say, no, it's fake, it's dramatized, and people are just trying to, farmers just trying to get the price up. But, there are times where it really happens.
And this really happened.
Right, this really happened. And the drought really happened also last year. There was a lot of, people saying, oh, the drought wasn't real, the drought didn't do anything. And so much so that I actually flew down to Brazil 3 times in the past 7 months.
Wow.
To actually see what was going on. Because again, sitting in my office in Panama, I'm in New York now, you say, well, how much is really true? And are people dramatizing and only showing the photos and circulating photos and images, the videos of the damaged area? And it's this small compared to Brazil is huge. And so I went down to really understand what was going on. So I went to Brazil in December to see the impact of the drought last October and the heat wave, and drove like 2,800 kilometers in 7 days, hitting all the major spots and speaking to farmers, hopping over fences, you name it. I did it to try and get onto farms. And also people were saying that maybe I was being steered to only places where there was damage. And so I was making all these impromptu roadside stops, hey, Marcel, let's stop here. Let's go there. Well, I don't want to go there. So I was trying to not that I was being led, but I also want to make sure that I wasn't, had some checks and balance in that, just to be sure. And it's pretty hard when you're in the heart of the coffee belt and you're driving past all this coffee along the road, or the coffee trees along the road, and you look at it and you're like, where's the coffee?
Right.
Okay.
The trees are there, but the cherries are not.
Bare branches. The trees were talking to me and telling me the story. And you can't be led to only see bad when you're doing one of these trips. And I was also making sure that I said, I don't want to just see the bad. I also want to see the great farms. I want to see where they survived, where they didn't have problems, and understand the tree. So that was in December. And in December, aside from, well, let me back up for a second and say something really important about that, that I don't know was really covered. The first major drought for the market was in 1985. And the drought that we had in 2020 was different than the drought in 1985, and was different from the or minor episodes of drought that we had in the middle of last decade. Okay, and that's because the timing. And so the drought in 1985 was just delayed rains. The rainy season started late, and so the flowering of the crop started late, and there was substantial damage from that drought. Okay, but once it started flowering, the rains continued and the drought was over.
Right.
Okay. In 2014 and 15, there was like 3 years, 1 year for the Arabica production. The drought was later. The drought was after the crop flowered, and then after the beans set, and then it got dry again and was dry during the maturation period where the beans were growing inside the cherry,
Mhm.
and there wasn't enough moisture. So you had, in that time, you had a successful flowering, you had a successful set of the cherry on the tree, but then it was too dry, and so the bean inside didn't form properly, and that helped to lower production.
Right.
And it was compromised in terms of the quality also.
And that was
And then
85.
that was, no, that was in 2014, 15.
Okay. 2014, 15.
And then the rains came and started to help to improve the situation, but it was a little late.
Mhm.
Okay. The situation in comparison for October 2020 was different than those two circumstances in that you had the flowering, and the flowering was excellent. And so the farmers thought that they really were going to have a really great off-year crop.
Mhm.
And then it stopped raining. And so the flowering aborted. And so the cherry didn't even develop. And so there
Wow.
were some farms that I went to, and they had no cherry because the fruit never set because the flower didn't take. And
Mm.
so it was a failed flowering. And that was the first time that the market experienced that.
Right.
And so it's one of these situations where, well, what do you mean there's no coffee on the tree? Of course there's coffee on the tree. It was a beautiful flowering because everyone saw the pictures.
Yeah, it
of
looked like
magnificent-
snow. There were so many flowers this past year that it looked like there was snow on the trees
Exactly. But then they wound up on the ground
and no cherries.
prematurely without the cherries. So now some farms were impacted differently than other farms because there's also some microclimates. And so not everything is uniform. It
Mhm.
never is, okay, because there's microclimates. So there was a couple of pockets that got rain and they had a beautiful crop,
Right.
okay, because they didn't have the same problem. Or irrigated farms.
Right.
And then younger trees were able to withstand the dry weather better. And
Mhm.
so the younger trees survived better than older trees because they didn't have to use as much energy.
Right.
And then the trees that had been skeletonized, like pruned way back from the year before, were able to survive for the same reason as the young trees, because they didn't have to expend their energy. They were rested trees.
Right.
And therefore, they didn't show as much damage from the situation.
But did they fruit?
Some
Okay.
to some degree, yeah, they didn't
Right.
lose as much.
Right.
Okay. So when you look at where there was the crop for 21, 22 that was just harvested, it was mostly off the trees that had previously been skeletonized the year before and the trees that were younger and some of the older or irrigated trees. Or sometimes there's even an area where there's like a water mine, a natural spring underneath the farm, and they're lucky and they had sufficient water to help the, not kill the roots even. And so from that perspective, there's always going to be pockets that were great and pockets that were worse than other areas.
Just
Depends
to
on the angle on the farm.
just to fill in people who aren't familiar with why the cherries are so important, perhaps you're not in the coffee industry and you're listening to this on Love and Other Delusions. Inside the cherry is the seeds, which we call coffee beans. So
Correct.
the complex agricultural processing that leads for you to end up with eventually roasted coffee really starts with the fruiting of the tree. Our industry, is heavily steeped in the quality of the cherry that's picked at the time of harvest, and the lack of quality, well, determines two different markets, essentially, the specialty industry versus the commodity industry. And so this cherry is what gets you your coffee bean. And if we don't have cherries, we don't have coffee.
Okay, so I'm going to back you up on that one.
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of the time frame. And it's
Yeah.
something that was really visible on my trip to Brazil in December, because I always kind of felt the same way. And I would say that the majority of people start with, when the tree flowers, this is the beginning for the next crop's development. That's actually not true.
Okay.
Okay. And long before the trees flower. So when the other tree, when at the same time as the trees were flowering, the branch is also growing. And you have to have a certain amount of branch growth to support the next crop. And so farmers count the nodes and the internodes, the space between the nodes, to know how the next crop is going to look even before it flowers.
Right. It's just so people understand what we mean by the nodes. If you've got the main branch and you've got the offshoots, that angle between them is little buds can form from there. And that's, as we talk about the frost, you'll understand why this is such a big deal moving forward with what happened with the frost events and how that's influenced. These are the things that farmers look at to determine what's coming next.
Right. So
go ahead.
Yeah. So as the branch grows out, you should have, depending on the clone, you could have, say, 14 nodes as a long branch. And in an off year, after you just had a big crop, you're going to have fewer nodes because the trees spent its energy.
Yeah.
And so maybe you'll have 10 nodes or 9 nodes, depending on the variety. If there's plentiful rain, you're going to have more nodes, the branch is going to be longer, and the space between them is going to be bigger. So the amount of rainfall is already influencing the crop long before it starts to flower. So there's that extra step in the process.
Wow.
And what has happened is, while I was there to look at the lack of flowering on the trees because it aborted and there wasn't that much cherry, at the same time it was being pointed out to me, look, the growth on the tree isn't what it should be. It's behind. And so the 22-23 crop, which is the one that's going to start flowering as soon as it starts to rain, okay, because we're in the winter right now, and when you get the spring rains, that's when the trees are going to bud and they're going to flower, and then the flowers set and the cherries form. Okay, but even in December, it was obvious to farmers that the branch growth was not long enough to call it an on-year crop for 22-23. And so it was compromised 8 months ago, 9 months ago. It was compromised since last, longer. It was compromised 10 months ago, since last October. And then the growth period for the branch, let's call it from even September, when the rains start, okay, and it can grow all the way up through May, although usually the growth starts to slow in March because the days start to get a little cooler and the sun isn't out as long, so you don't have as many hours of sunshine, and so the growth isn't going to be as strong. So the biggest growth period is really October through March. And in December, they were saying, well, maybe we could get 3 more nodes, 4 more nodes, and they were estimating how much it would be and how much behind it was on a percentage basis. Well, we're 2 nodes short, we're 4 nodes short, 7 nodes short, depended on the area.
Right.
So there was trouble brewing long before the frost that we just had.
So help us understand, let's say that the nodes are 3 nodes short, 4 nodes short. What does that eventuate out into reality?
Okay, so let's talk about, so on a node, you have a rosetta forms of where the beans form around the node. And typically you'd find on a perfect rosetta, you can find as many as 23 cherries forming. Many have less because there could be something where the cherries are large and they crowd out the space, and then some have to drop off. And it's the same way when you have a flowering. There's always going to be some flowers that fall to the floor. That's very natural, that you lose even as much as half the flowers. That's normal. But it's when you lose excessive amounts, that's the problem.
Because the flower is going to turn into the fruit, and if the flower's gone, the fruit's not going to eventuate.
Then it doesn't fix. It doesn't set the crop. And that's what happens.
And then you get a reduction in yield, which means that the producer's income is severely compromised because they don't have any cherries to pick and turn into green coffee, which then gets roasted.
So there's different types of measuring yield. Okay. So let's talk about that for a second. So there's the amount of cherry that you're getting off the tree.
Right.
Okay. How many cherries are you getting off the tree? And then you have some basic standards in terms of maybe you need 500 liters to get a bag of coffee, to get a 60 kilo bag of coffee. If the bean inside is small because you didn't have sufficient moisture during its development time, or temperatures were too hot, or something happened to compromise that, then the yield from the bean itself is lower.
Right.
And so that standard of, well, you get a bag from 500 liters, maybe it takes 600 liters to fill the bag. And that's what happened during harvest, where suddenly the crop came in lower than expected. And you say, well, how did it come in lower when we know how many, cherries were on the tree, or you could count? Well, it was because the beans were smaller, they were lighter weight, and therefore it took more to get to weight.
So it's not just cherry fruiting that we count, it's the quality of the cherry that ends up eventuating into how many
quality of bean inside the cherry.
Yeah, it goes into the bag to create a full 60 kilo bag.
Right.
It often fascinates me when people think that coffee's such a simple agricultural product.
No, it's not.
Because it's not like picking oranges. It's really not picking oranges. And yet we seem to have this idea on the consuming end. Well, there seems to be this fallacy that coffee should be cheap.
Well, when you see what the farmers go through, then you have a very, very different perspective. You got to be boots on the ground.
Right.
And so, I was there in December and I saw the hardship. And then it rained, and I wanted to see what was going to happen after it rained for the cherries that did develop, and whether that intense heat in October was going to create a uniform crop or not, and if there was going to be problems. And also, when you have extremely dry conditions, then you could wind up with disease, increased incidence of disease. Right. Also, you could have a situation where the cherries ripen prematurely, where they don't last until maturity, they drop off, they just turn dark, and they never really ripen properly. There's fungus, all sorts of problems that had developed. The rust is on the leaves, and it's really like a mite, like a little fly. And then it lands and it lays its eggs, and the larvae forms, and it's like a tiny little white.
Do you mean the boring beetle?
Worm. So this is Bushnia. So there's rust, which you can see that. Well, yeah. So that you could see is sort of like a burnty orange color, like spots, and you could see it on the other side of the leaf. But there was another problem there, and it's causing black spots on the leaves, and you could kind of like peel it up, and so
Wow.
if you lift it up and underneath like the top layer of the leaf, you could find this tiny little larvae,
Okay.
the insect. It looks like it's white. It looks like a little worm,
Right.
and that's making holes in the leaves.
Which compromises its ability to generate energy for the plant and
Correct.
grow fruit. And
Right.
then we've got other things like the boring beetle that gets into the cherry and
Right.
infects
That's
that as well.
broca.
That's
Right.
broca.
And so that on the end of the cherry, you could see where there's like it drills a little hole. And the problem with that is when it goes through the cherry and goes into the bean, then it makes a hole in the bean, but it also leaves an enzyme. And so that impacts the quality of the coffee.
Right. Right. So the thing that I want people to understand is that all that we've just been talking about is still with the cherry on the tree, right? We haven't even talked about then how hard it is. And I always fuck this word up, the demucilagination. Did I say it right? Demucilagination. I did say it right. The demucilagination, which is like the removal of the mucilage from around the seed and removing the outside of the cherry. All of that needs to happen. The processing of that cherry is then the next part of doing all of this. You don't just pick a cherry and somehow squash it and the seed comes out. It doesn't work like that. There's a
whole... You also have to let the cherry dry.
Right.
Okay, so in Brazil, let's talk about, there's different processes that are done. Okay, so the typical in Central America, Colombia, you remove the bean from the cherry, and then you let the green bean dry on the sun patios. And so in that process of removal, you wash it and then you dry the green bean. In Brazil, there's another form, and it's called natural process, where it's dried within the cherry and then it's removed. And so then the contract in New York calls for washed Arabica coffee. And so most of the Brazilian crop isn't even deliverable against the New York contract. But then Brazil started with this like semi-washed process where the quality is good enough or sometimes to be acceptable and pass grading on the exchange.
Right. So as like whether you're in the coffee industry or not in the coffee industry, understanding the complexity of what it takes for producers to go from planting a seedling to actually getting to the eventual green bean that gets shipped to the country it's going to be roasted in. We roast the coffee and then the barista turns it into a beverage for you, or you turn it into a beverage for yourself.
You have to have a skilled barista.
Yeah, right.
It has to be stored properly. It has to be shipped properly.
It has to be roasted
and
properly.
Sensitive to humidity. Right. Exactly. So
go ahead.
So you can have a farmer who put every bit of care into it, and once it's out of control, it can be ruined.
Right. And even in the shipping process,
right,
it can be ruined in the container, whether it's stored in Grain Pro or jute bags, or all of these different things influence the way that coffee is going to eventually taste. People just think, oh, coffee shows up, it gets roasted, and it's the roaster and the barista that determine the quality of the coffee. Hundreds of hands touch your coffee before it gets to you, and all of them influence the flavor of the way and the quality of that coffee as it's going to eventuate into your cup. And this is why it's so important for us to start educating the general public about two things: why all coffee is not created equally,
right,
and two, why we need to start shifting public perception about what it means to pay for a coffee. because I have a deep belief that we have a branding problem in coffee. The term coffee has a branding problem. We call instant coffee, coffee. We call roasted coffee, coffee. We call espresso coffee. We call batch brew coffee.
Because it is all coffee.
It
and
is
in the
all,
same way as
right.
you call wine, whether it's jug or corked or,
Right. Right. But the
the
wine
high-end
industry
bottles.
the wine industry has done an amazing job of marketing wine. Right? When you're getting a cheap
coffee
wine.
Industry it's so much better than it was 30 years ago.
But that doesn't mean it's good enough.
So, I mean,
right.
The Specialty Coffee Association has done an incredible job, and everyone in the industry to really, really try to educate consumers and have people within the industry to even educate the people, through the value chain.
And yet the price of coffee hasn't moved the needle much for producers over the last 30 years. And the price of...
Let's talk about that though.
But just let me finish that thought.
Okay.
So also moving the price of a cup of coffee is incredibly difficult from the consuming end. So rather than increase prices on the consuming end, business owners go into their COGS to cut costs, which then has a backflow effect to producers. Rather than increasing our prices so that we can improve profit margins, we cut our COGS so that we're down to 3% on average net profit in a cafe.
So I used to own some cafes in Panama, by the way.
Oh,
so
nice.
Well aware of all
No, I know you are. I'm saying this for the
let's
benefit.
back up on something
about
the futures price.
Right.
Okay, because there's some misunderstandings there. Okay, and it's not quite the same picture. Let's look at Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 30 years ago, Brazil used to have far less coffee planted per hectare.
Mm-hmm.
So they have more than doubled the number of trees per hectare. And they're so much more sophisticated in their agricultural practices and techniques and understanding the trees, and some with irrigation, that the yields that they're getting per tree have increased at the same time that they've doubled their productivity per hectare.
And mechanization, right?
And mechanized farming to cut down on labor costs. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so because of all those practices, Brazil especially has a much lower cost of production per hectare, okay, when you measure it by yield, although their costs have gone up also, which is why they went to mechanized harvesting. Mm-hmm. And this year, especially fertilizer prices and other inputs and insurance. So their costs have gone up over the years, but they have also increased the varieties. Mm-hmm. And they've managed through the increased yields per tree and the increased density to keep up. And so they're making more per hectare. So the price per pound might be very much what it was 20 years ago, but if you're getting double the productivity on the same land, mm-hmm. then you're increasing your income. And so we can't forget about how technology has improved somewhat, and you can't just look at the price and say, well, it hasn't really kept up with inflation, because there's other factors.
Right.
Okay. And then the other thing is when you look at the price differentially, so again, mm-hmm. cash minus futures, the differentials, the premiums that are being paid or rewarded to farmers right now are substantial compared to where they were 20, 30 years ago. And that's also recognized for the quality, for the improvements in quality and the willingness to compensate the producer over the futures market price. So when futures prices are depressed, then the differential, that premium that's being paid, tends to increase. Some of that had to do with some of the certification programs also. So Rainforest Alliance and UTS,
Fair
Fair
trade.
Trade.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of that helped to spur the movement after the 2000 price crisis, when prices fell to historic lows, and roasters understood that if they don't compensate the farmers properly, they're not going to have coffee in the future. And so they recognize that, and
That's
we're
generous.
willing to pay. Well, they absolutely may recognize that they have to do something to increase the income, and they were willing to pay, higher differentials.
And just for people listening, to give you some context of what might warrant these extra differentials, just a quick background. There's two, in the Arabica world, there's two different kinds of markets. There's the specialty market, for whatever that means now, and there's the commodity side of things. Now, your instant coffee is made with commodity grade coffee. Your specialty coffee requires much more attention to detail from the producer. Sorry?
So my computer started to.
Oh no, it's all good from so you need
okay. Okay. Yeah, no.
You got battery?
I don't know, it wasn't that. It was
Okay.
like Outlook started to put up all these contact reminders. So, I thought it was like you were hearing all the sounds from, I was trying to close it delicately. Okay.
So just to go back to that. So we have two different markets. We've got the specialty market and we've got the commercial or commodity market. And your instant coffee, your Nescafe Blend 43 is made with commodity coffee. And what happens there is when there is green cherries or ripe cherries, it doesn't really matter. So a machine may go in, or pickers may go in and take all the cherries off that tree, and that goes into the commodity market. The specialty market requires much more attention to detail from the farming practices perspective, and therefore much higher labor costs are required when it comes to picking cherries and processing the coffee to make sure that the quality is at the quality that's required to be sold through a variety of different ways to different people and different roasters on the consuming end. So that's where very, very generally, that's the difference between the two. And it's important to understand that when we talk about different kinds of coffee, it's legitimately different. And there's a score that's not necessary to get into for people who aren't in the coffee industry, but there's a score, and specialty is 80 and above, and commodity is less than 80. Okay, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I do.
I know you can.
There's so much a farmer can do, but if he's not at the right altitude and he doesn't have the right soil condition, he could spend all the money and do everything right, but he might not be able to get some of these higher scores.
Right.
And therefore he's prejudiced because of where his farm is. And he can't do that much better in terms of, the quality. He can use better hybrids, and there's a lot that can be done to improve that quality, but sometimes it might never yield the same as on the specialty coffee.
Right.
And at the same time, on some of the farms that are the noted specialty farms, okay, where you're getting the beautiful coffee, sometimes their expenses are so high and their yields might be less, especially on organic, that the market might not be willing to compensate them as much as they should be.
Right.
It's all driven by supply and demand.
And this is where these differentials come in, just for the sake of people listening. This is where you'll get the base price plus a differential for organic, a differential for specialty, a differential for this, a differential for that. And that's all determined in the negotiations of the contract.
But let's look at Honduran coffee or Mexican coffee, which used to trade at a discount, and routinely trades at a positive differential. And so even some of the base grade coffee that is what compromises the, that comprises the coffee off the exchange. There's certain standards to that as well. And they're in, rewarded also. So it depends on supply and demand. When there's massive oversupply, then unfortunately the price is going to sink. And there's this fallacy about, in terms of economics 101, that, the price should never go below the cost of production.
Yeah, well, producers will tell you that ain't fucking true.
Okay, well, the costs, in anything, if there's oversupply, then to drive out that supply, the price is going to have to dip below the cost of production. And those that are the most efficient will survive. And that also drives competition and also drives efficiency, because farmers know that to survive, they have to be more efficient. And that helps to improve quality.
Right.
Also.
You are definitely an economist.
It's a delicate thing to tell someone, I know so many hundreds of growers, and to sit here and say, well, sometimes the price has to go below the cost of production. But that means then that when prices are high, you have to be prepared. And that you have to kind of save and do what you can. And it's why best care practices matter, so that you're the one who continues to be able to grow coffee and diversify.
Except another part of this picture that we need to help people understand is that Brazil has a variety of larger growers as well as smallholder producers. Much of Central America and a lot of growers in Africa are majority smallholder producers.
Correct.
And so we need
they're not mechanized, harvested
at all.
I mean, in a complete Brazil is in a completely different scale.
Right. So we need to give people an understanding of that. So go.
Sure. And Vietnam also.
And Vietnam.
And so, there's things that are being done, but it's consolidation. And if you look at any industry, there's also consolidation of, who can manage and where the market's going to be driven to. And the market is accepting the Brazilians. But you have to say there's also technology that has helped to push that, because roasters have become far more efficient. So in 1997, so there was the 1994 frost. There were two frosts that year also. There was a June frost and a July frost that did considerable damage. At that time, though, Brazil had ample stocks. Brazil was sitting on 17 million bags of government-owned stocks. And today, by the way, zero.
Yeah.
Okay.
Jonas told us that.
So, and so you can't compare 1994 to the frost that we just had, the string of freezes that we had last month, and say, oh, well, it wasn't nearly as bad. Well, you don't have the stocks. You don't have the reserves.
And this is the other thing about the coffee bros that are going out there and saying, oh, it's all fake news. They're withholding supply to drive the price up. The government's got coffee in stores. And I'm like, they don't. That's all gone.
No,
it's all gone.
That's what happened that was the story in 1994.
Right. They were dumping it off containers, and remember? That's the story.
There was a retention, right. There was a retention plan in 1994 where the government had been buying up coffee, and that's how they wound up with 17 million bags. In 1975, so that was before my time in the industry. At least
that's the year I was born.
Right. So, so in 1975 was the Great Freeze, and
in
at
Brazil.
that time, And at that time, you had growers all over the world holding back supply of coffee and not willing to sell, realizing that the price was going up, was expecting it to keep going up. And so it got to the point where the consumers started attacking Brazil and the coffee growers of the world for intentionally withholding the supply to drive the market even higher. And the US and Europeans were talking about, we're going to boycott coffee. So that was in 75, 76.
Yeah, right.
When the market went to all-time highs. And, at that time, that was sort of what was going on. But it's not necessarily the same story this time.
Right. And we're going to talk about the Brazil frost
Right.
that happened in July in a second. But to help people understand, like the issue with regards to what's happened over the last couple of decades with smallholder producers in Central America, across the world, with regards to coffee, these are typically quite poor people who have inherited land and third, fourth, fifth generation coffee producers. And the cost of production is already on a razor's edge compared to what they're getting paid. And they are perhaps, in a lot of instances, from people who I've personally had on the podcast that oversee a lot of these producers, are saying they're inheriting debt from previous crises.
Right.
And when they're inheriting debt, we're not talking about like the 3% that we have to pay in interest here when we buy a home. This is often between 30 and 50% interest rates that producers have to pay on these loans. Right, Judy?
Well, there's that inheritance, but let's talk about the farm itself, that maybe it's not as efficient as it needs to be.
Right.
And in situations like that, where they have to, maybe the trees are very aged and aren't producing nearly as much as they should be. So it needs a whole renovation. And there's an education process to understand for the next generation of what is the best fertilizer, what is the best care, how should you prune and manage your farm, and then also to consider, based on the soil and the climatic conditions, what can you do? Do you need to put some shade, whether it's banana, and can you intercrop? So pepper is used heavily in Vietnam, and there's also pepper that's grown in Brazil.
Capsicum. You mean capsicum, like
for black pepper, red pepper, correct.
Yep.
And it's very well suited. And so in Brazil, you have that where it's
you mean peppercorns? Peppercorns.
Yeah, peppercorns.
Yeah, not capsicum.
Yeah,
not peppers, as it was.
Right.
Yeah.
So peppercorns. Yeah. Okay. So, but there's other crops also that you could intercrop with. Black pepper happens to be one of them.
And what does the peppercorns do for coffee crops? I missed that, sorry.
Well, it's providing extra income.
Oh, okay. Yep. And what we started to see in previous years, recent years, was that the C market, that's the exchange in New York for anyone that's listening. It's called the ICE exchange, but in the industry, we call it the C market. So recently we saw producers so frustrated by how low the C market got. It fell well below $1. And they just started chopping down their coffee trees. This is a lot of the smallholder producers, and saying that it makes more sense for them to grow avocados and grow pineapples and grow all of these other things that were more suited to their environment, because even though the farm they were on traditionally grew coffee, it now no longer makes sense. And
there's also climate change, where some areas that were suited for coffee are no longer suited for coffee.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem also.
And so I kind of raise all of this stuff about
Mhm.
smallholder producers so that people can start paying attention to the fact that if we don't start recognizing that not all coffee is created equal, and we need to start paying attention to the different kinds of coffees, we're going to start to lose producers in coffee for different reasons. Some of them for climate change, other because they're not getting paid what they consider a fair price. And what I call a fair price is a price that covers their production cost for the crop, plus enough for them to live off.
Right.
And none of these producers are living lavishly. They're barely surviving. And so this is where we on the consuming end of the market need to start getting, as the consumers, not as the industry. The industry has a long way to go in understanding enough. But as consumers, we need to start getting our heads around, when I'm drinking a cup of coffee, where has that come from? How much has gone into creating this beyond the barista and the roaster?
So part of the issue is if you raise the price in the store, right, on the retail side, is it going to filter back down to the producer? And that's a very different story because, you know, from a retailer perspective, maybe in their heart, they want to do more and pay more for the coffee, but they just had an increase in rent. They just had, you know, government inspector come in and tell them they had to change something and spend $5,000 to do that. Or maybe they had a flood and their inventory was damaged and then they had to do some repairs. And then there was an increase in the minimum wage in the country that they're in. And then they have to start paying insurance and all these other factors come into play. And one of the suppliers, you know, for the milk increased the price. And all of a sudden, all that money that you were thinking, well, I can pay more for the coffee, you're saying it's gone. Or the landlord increased the price on the rent, and then you have to pay for increased marketing. And it's a never ending of expenses that make it impossible sometimes to just say, okay, well, I can't even pay more for the coffee.
Yeah.
Because you can't raise the price because the guy who's in the corner and maybe has a smaller space, whatever his deal is, okay, or her deal on their shop, or somehow they have even a gimmick type thing, okay, you have to compete against that, or 10 other shops open around you. And then it's, well, do I have to compete on price also? And it's difficult. The retailers, you know, you think they're making a ton of money,
they're really not,
and can afford to, but they're getting just as squeezed on costs and everything else. And there isn't that conversation in the industry either.
Well, there is now on the consuming end. There's a lot.
I think the pandemic helped that to some degree.
I agree, and and to back you up on that, it's only become very recent. Because now we are seeing a convergence of issues across the value chain in the coffee industry that are screaming out, like, when you ask the question, who's making all the money in coffee? Because it's not me, and it's not you, and it's not you, and it's not you. Who's making all the fucking money? Because there's
cannibalism, because you have, you know, in a small town, all of a sudden you have 5, 6 coffee shops that there's enough of the population to support it. And so someone opened up their coffee shop and they had, you know, tremendous traffic to begin with, but then someplace else opened up and everyone says, oh, let's go try the new place.
Yeah. And we've got a saturation now. And we've got, as sad as it is to say, we've got a number of events that are happening right now that are causing a correction in the market. Here in Sydney, we're in week 7 of what is going to be at least a 10-week lockdown. We anticipate that it's going to go for something like 20 to 25 weeks.
Wow.
And this is like
So I haven't been in lockdown yet.
She covers her mouth as though she's a cheeky, naughty girl for that. You ever been in lockdown anywhere?
I can, I mean, look,
Woman, Panama was in lockdown. What are you talking about?
I missed it. I missed it. I was I'm on the board of the Palau Coffee Company. And I had this trip arranged for months that I was going to Palau to work on a development project and meeting some people from Indonesia there to help develop Palau's coffee sector. And so mid-March, I went on this business trip to Palau. And while I was flying to Honolulu, Panama locked the airport and I wasn't getting home. And then when I got to Guam, I was the last flight into Palau, which is still one of the handful of countries that is still COVID-free.
So you got to operate freely in Palau.
I was swimming with baby sharks and playing with Jocko the dolphin.
So you couldn't leave the country, but you weren't really affected because it was a great place to be.
It was like the safest place in the world.
Yeah, wow.
A Pacific Island with 20,000 people. So so my pandemic experience is a little different.
It's very different to everybody else's, because let me tell you, I've been locked down for feels like a year and a half. I had the few months when I got back from the US and moved back here in January. There were a few months where it felt kind of mind trippy because it felt like I'd left San Diego, got on a plane and turned up in a wormhole in the past, because everybody was walking around with no masks on and there were no guns and there was no Trump and there was no this and there's no that. And then shit got real again. Now we can't leave our homes, and there's parts of Sydney with military on the street.
We had I was playing Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'm happy for you.
Look, I made up for it because I actually flew to Brazil 3 times during the pandemic, and 2 of the times I wasn't vaccinated, and I was, Miss Clorox there and Lysol.
Did you get any COVID or anything?
No.
Good for you. I got it right at the beginning, like the 9th of March. I had COVID, so got it out of the way. But now this Delta variant is an interesting one. So now let's talk about back to coffee. Let's talk about frost, because on the Love and Other Delusions podcast, we're trying to get people to understand how these weather events and changes in the shifting climate are things you should be paying attention to that will have ramifications in your average daily movements. And a cup of coffee is one perfect example of how something as simple as you being able to reach for a cup of coffee every day could be affected by climate shifting. So tell us what happened in July. Talk to us about frost and the historic events of that.
I was actually in Brazil. My 3rd trip was when the frost hit.
On the 1st of July or
on
the 2nd
of July? First of July. So I was there. And so it was one of these things where it was cold the night before and we're watching the temperature, and it was like, okay, do we go out at 5 o'clock in the morning and look for frost? And then on the farm where I was staying, it didn't seem like there was going to be damage there. And so we kind of said, okay, we'll go out. And then in the morning, we drove and, wow, there's frost there, and it was in that area, it was hit, much harder than we thought. And it wasn't bad. We went to one farm that was 120 hectares, and they had 20 hectares that were damaged. But I was able to see the whole frost cycle. So when in the morning, the sun had melted the ice and the leaves started to get like burning around the edges and darkened spots, and the color of the leaf was fading. So it was going from the green color to a yellowish, and you knew it wasn't going to survive. And most of the damage was to the leaves and not to the stem or to the branch itself. And so it was not quite as severe as what happened on July 20th, but it was a wake-up call. And there were some areas where they were really surprised. They did not expect to have the losses that they did. And it was in mostly, lower altitude and pocketed areas. And what happens is the cold basically runs down the slope of the mountain, and it's very much like running water. And then it pockets at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
It just, stops there. And then the longer the duration during the night, then the further up the slope they'll go as the pool of cold air develops.
Right.
And the longer the cold sits on the trees, then the more damage that's going to happen. But the trees that were further up the slope, you might not see visible damage on them because frost didn't form, but that cold air still was a shock to those trees and passed through them. And you don't know how they're going to react until the rains come. And so what's happening now is there's a few assumptions that are going on that aren't really 100% of the picture.
Okay, tell us.
Okay, so it's assumed that where you don't have visible damage, that the tree is going to be fine.
It's resilient. It'll be fine.
Okay,
Everything's going to be
right. I used to say that myself. It's, Brazilian trees are Teflon and they bounce back, and that's what, how Brazil is. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But the trees were already weakened because you had below normal rainfall, okay, for months. And this is something else, before I forget to tell you, when I was there in June, July, what I noticed on the trees was there was an irregular rain event the end of May into early June. There were some irregular rains at the start of the winter. And
high rains,
everyone rains in Sul de Minas and the Sahara region, and everyone kind of said, oh, the rain is going to bring relief. And the market went down, believing the rains were beneficial to the trees because it helped to relieve some of the stress in the soil moisture. Mm-hmm. And the leaves started to look a little more refreshed. That was the belief by the market. The reality was a little different. Okay. And I was surprised at that because I expected the relief side, that the rains did more good than harm. But when I was there, what I found was that on these branches, which I already said were smaller to begin with, was that they were budding. You start to see, one, there was some premature flowering, which would be lost. The crop wasn't going to be dealt. And you can't flower on the same space twice. So there's other spots on the node. Remember, you could have up to 23 cherries, but if you had flowering already that was lost, that takes away from the perfection for the next crop. And there were some areas that had bloom, but then there was two other things I noticed, that some of the nodes, the leaves were starting to form. And so a stress tree, one that is in need of energy, is going to produce leaves instead of flowers. And the trees were already stressed before this cold. Mm-hmm. They were starting to be dehydrated already. And then I saw also on many, many trees and through all the regions where I went, there was also some buddings that were forming, like the premature buds. And they've been without rain now since the beginning of June, and rain isn't forecast until at least the first week of September. That's 90 days without rain on these premature buds, and they're not going to make it. And that means that there's some loss to the crop that is irregardless of the frost. That was going to happen anyway because of the drought. And people have to take this dry weather really, really seriously because there's problems from it already. Now, so you have two strikes against the crop from the smaller branches and some of this premature budding that is going to be lost. Some farmers are happy that it's going to be lost, okay? And to them, it's good news because it would be much worse if they survived, the cherry grew, and then you had cherries growing on the tree using that energy to form those cherries, and then those cherries ripening prematurely, and there's no way with mechanized harvesting you're going to be able to harvest the cherries at different times. And so create more of a problem, more of a loss, because the energy the tree is using for that. So farmers are happy that it didn't come to that, okay? But at the same time, it still represents a loss.
Right.
It's less space for this crop to flower. And I already saw evidence that the trees were suffering and that they were going to be growing more leaves than they normally would instead of flowering. Now you introduce the cold.
Right.
And what people forget about when they, the third frost didn't cause as much visible damage, but it might have been even more potent than the July 20th frost. Sometimes you don't see your enemy, okay? And cold is the enemy to the trees. And it created 3 days of very cold temperatures. And there were some areas that did have frost. But when the trees were hit by the July 20th cold, then on the lowest lying areas were the worst, you had them defoliate. So now those trees are exposed, they're already shocked, and then you blast them with more cold weather. And cold dehydrates. So you had a string of frosts, very cold temperatures that dehydrate the tree after it's already starved for moisture because of the drought.
And just to give people some context about why that's really important, if you listened to the conversation that we had with agronomist Jonas Fechereso, you'll remember that he was talking about the canopy of the older trees that have excuse me, that have all this foliage around them. And the foliage helps protect the stem from the frost that's on the outside. Now, we have the first frost event on the 1st of July, and that hits the leaves. As Judith was saying, it burnt them and it caused them to disintegrate.
But it was spotty, it was on patchy areas, okay?
Right.
You had it, driving by, there was someone, oh, look, that was frost, that wasn't. But it wasn't really a widespread situation.
Right.
The July 20th one.
The second round comes. And so for those trees that had been affected by the 1st of July frost, now their stems are exposed. Now the nodes are exposed. Remember, we were speaking earlier about those nodes. So now the tree is more compromised, the second round of frost. And if it hadn't been compromised, for those trees that weren't compromised in the first round of frost, now they're getting hit by a colder frost on July the 20th. Then the 29th of July happens.
Well, 29th, 30th, and 31st.
Right. It went for 3 days. Right. And this is the third round of frost. And so you've got trees that got hit 3 times. You've got trees that got hit twice, and you've got trees that
were hit once. Okay. So the point on that is those that were hit and might have just had leaf damage and some minor stem damage now it takes 10 days to see the tree start to die if its vascular system was impacted. So the vascular system is the method of transport for carrying water and nutrients down to the roots and through the branch, and the energy from the leaves down and the water up. Okay. And when that is damaged, when that tissue is damaged, the tree is going to die. And so now the videos are starting to come out where growers are taking knives and cutting away the bark and underneath they see the dark spots. And those trees have to be removed. And that is a need for replanting. But you also have a very large amount of the nurseries that would provide the seedlings for replacement for those trees were also damaged.
Yeah.
And you also have to time it right for when you're actually doing the planting to be optimal with the weather conditions. And so we're looking at replanting not happening immediately.
No.
I mean, it's a problem.
There are some really great videos out. Jonas posted a couple of photos of an example of what you were talking about, Judy, where you've got necrosis in a plant. This was from the second frost. Necrosis in the plant because the sap in the vascular system in the center of the stem had frozen, and as it froze, it expanded and ruptured the vascular system in the plant.
So there's the sap in the branches, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and that freezes and can cause the problems. And then there's also the water in the leaves
Mm-hmm.
that cause the rupture of the membranes. But on the trunk of the tree,
Mm-hmm.
through the vascular system, what's being transported is the water and the nutrients. And
Right.
when that's compromised, the tree is just going to die.
And that's what a lot of
right.
That's what we're seeing a lot of right now, coming to light, as you were saying, now that it's had time to show itself. We're about
it's about 10 days after the frost,
right,
where you start to see the damage. And this is what's happening now. And so a lot of people, when they looked at the trees, they made snap judgment about what was, how much was lost or not. They didn't wait. And you can't see that from aerial footage or even from a drone, because the tree didn't speak yet. And the tree tells the story.
And so we've got a situation where this is coming to light. Producers are now showing videos of them having to remove trees. And for people who aren't aware, not only do we have to refill the nurseries, these producers have to refill their nurseries with new plants, but it takes a coffee tree a few years to actually cherry for the first time.
That's correct. So there's two things that are there. Well, I want to say there's three things that can happen. And it's also not recommended unless you see that the tree is dying, okay, then it has to be uprooted, okay? Mm-hmm. Farmers can also see where, from their experience, it's damaged enough that they know that the branches were compromised and they're better off stumping the tree. So the tree can grow back. So you can, where you need to completely uproot it, mm-hmm. and that's a longer process. Or you could stump the tree to about 30 centimeters above the ground. And then they're hoping that by December, after there's sufficient rain, they'll start to see some new shoots developing. And then they know that the tree is going to be able to survive, and that in 2 years' time, they're going to have a crop. So they didn't just lose this year's production. They also lost the next year's production when they stumped the tree. But and there's some...
Go ahead.
If they stumped it and then they didn't know and wait to see if the vascular system was damaged or not, and they just cut, okay, maybe there isn't going to be enough rain. They don't know if it's going to take. Right.
Because we're in a drought, remember.
Uproot it, right. They might have to uproot it anyway. And so they're wasting this time, okay, because they're not going to be able to do anything anyway. It's the wrong time for the replanting. So it's a nightmare for them. The other thing that they hope to be able to do is basically to skeletonize the tree. So you leave the trunk intact and maybe leave one major branch, and then you cut all the branches. And so you're going to lose this year's crop, and then the hope for the branches to have sufficient rain and grow and have enough nodes on them to have a good crop for the following year. So they lose the 1 year's production. Other farmers hope that maybe they didn't have to. Now, there were some farms where, the farmer skeletonizes the tree and prunes the tree on a very regular basis because the tree can be exhausted. They have to see how the tree responds. And even where there wasn't that much visible damage, was the tree stressed from the cold? Even if there wasn't frost formed on the leaves, even if the leaves didn't drop off yet, is that tree stressed enough that's going to be able to flower properly, support the flowers, and then support the crop? Does it have enough energy? And we don't know that yet. And it depends on when the rains come, how much rain, and how much shock the tree was in from the series of cold weather events, plus the drought.
Plus the drought, plus the pandemic, plus the logistical issues that are going on, plus
that's
the
an
truckers,
entirely
right. Well, I'm making
story.
a point though.
Right.
Plus the truckers strike that's going on in Brazil, plus the issues with mobility of the workforce from the north of Brazil, plus shipping prices up 600%, plus.
It's a lot.
It's a lot, folks. And
okay.
Go ahead.
You forgot a few things on that list.
Oh, please help me there.
While we're at it, okay, let's talk about the fact that Brazil exported their past 2021 crop fairly aggressively and had record exports, and their consumption held up, and therefore they don't have much in stock compared to last time. And there's a lot of talk where people say, oh, there's plenty of coffee around, right? And so when I was there, I went into a couple of warehouses expecting to see, that there's plenty of past crop coffee there. And I was in this one warehouse that can hold 1 million bags. And they actually gave me the printout for that day, real-time data. There's just over 234,000 bags, 70% were past crop. So I kept saying, where is the new crop? Well, I expected to be there to see the harvest and to see the trucks lining up. And I knew the crop was going to be small, but I didn't think it was going to vaporize. Okay. And I didn't expect to see non-movement. And I know someone who was just there, this past week, and she said the exact same thing. There was hardly any movement. And when I talked to people in Brazil, there isn't the movement. And so where is the coffee? I even did a post on LinkedIn. I put the old, Burger King commercial with Clara Peller, where's the beef?
Yeah.
Where's the coffee? It's
gone.
A mystery. Everyone says there's different stories. Oh, the crop was late. Oh, there's plenty of coffee around. Oh, some people admit that some of it wasn't sold to the cooperatives. Other people say the farmers were holding back. Others say, oh, well, it hasn't been delivered yet because they weren't able to harvest it because there were some insurance claims on it and the insurance adjusters didn't come. But others say that no, hardly anyone has insurance. So I'm getting like every version of a story to try and explain where the past crop was. Reality is it was really small.
Because of the drought and
the failed flowering. And
that's what Jonas said to us as well.
Right. And then it came in even lighter because the dry weather continued. And March and April, when it's the time for the bean to size and to finish developing within the cherry, it came in light. And some farmers say it wasn't really that dry weather. They believe that it was the initial damage, that it just, the bean didn't develop properly. It doesn't matter. The end result is
a drop in yield. So Brazil is the number one coffee producing country in the world, and it's experiencing a clusterfuck right now. Then we've got Vietnam that's getting bent over in horrible ways with COVID right now. And Colombia experiencing its own geopolitical issues with regards to what's going
I
on
mean,
with the government.
that was resolved, and they've really tried to make up on the shipments that were delayed, and it's resolving. You saw last month's exports were, or June exports were 934,000, was 200,000 off. That coffee is going to come out. The Colombian Coffee Federation was very on top of the entire situation. I mean, they really
Right.
did a commendable job keeping people aware of what was happening.
Right. The only issue there is that we have a serious container shortage worldwide.
That is true.
And this
You
is why I'm
can't,
saying,
and it's
right.
getting worse.
So we've got, and it's absolutely getting worse. Anyone who's on the Map of Forward mailing list has all this information. We send out an email every week talking about these kinds of things. But you've got compounding effects that are coming from not just the growing side of things. You've got the logistical issues that are presenting very real challenges to moving coffee, even when it is coming out of those countries.
So here's something to sort of mull over, okay? And that is how coffee is traded, okay? So one large roaster was quoted as saying that they're not concerned about the pricing because they have forward contracts they contracted for 14 months of supply.
Good luck.
And that is paper, okay?
That's exactly
you can't deliver
right.
paper to your customers, okay? And
Step one, secure the supply. Step two, you actually have to take receipt of the supply.
Right.
If it's not available, it's not available.
So let's talk about what is going to happen, because my understanding right now that, typically the normal is roasters take the summer off and come back in September and buy coffee for the winter. And most roasters, larger roasters are contracted out a year plus, okay? And then they do fill in as needed. But here's a situation where they're normal buying, they come in, but they're not getting that coffee in a timely basis. So if you want basically coffee for December going into the US or European winter, then it's got to be on a container today.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Okay. When there's an issue in Brazil, right, where the farmers sold that coffee promised that coffee to cooperatives at less than half of what the current price is today. Before they had the drought problems, they had contracted to sell some of that coffee, believing that they were going to have that coffee. And then you get lower yields. And so there's a problem because there's some overcommitments. And then you have prices go up even further because the frost, and some farmers lost in the drought and now lost it all in the frost. I know some who they kicked it when I was there. I visited their farm in December and in March, okay, or February rather. And they were like kicking their trees and saying, "This is popcorn. There's nothing here," And they were like just so upset.
Heartbroken,
that's what they were doing. Okay, they had more dragon fruit than coffee.
Wow.
and it was Harlan, beautiful farm, nicest man, and he lost it. And now his farm was devastated by the frost.
What do you say to people? We've got clients, consulting clients, and people in mastermind groups and listeners of the podcast in Map of Forward that are saying, Lee, I don't understand what's going on. I hear you saying on the podcast that there's going to be a coffee shortage and it's going to be harder to get coffee. And yet I go and speak to my green importer and they're telling me is just hype. It's not going to be a problem. We're going to continue to be able to give you green coffee?
Well, part of it is that that's always been the way it is. Okay. So they might be able to give you green coffee, but are they willing to pay the price to get it to you? Okay. That's the magic wording. And I don't know if that's going to be. And this is the first time where Brazil has had a crisis like this, one back-to-back years. And it's really 3 years, because there's a lot of trees that are being cut down right now. They're just being chopped down, and they're not producing the year after either. So, it becomes multi-year. So Brazil doesn't have the stock. So all the excess surplus stock in the market right now is actually sitting in Europe. And it's the coffee that wasn't really consumed during the pandemic that declined. And so there was a buildup in European stocks. You're talking about a couple million bags.
That's not a lot.
It's not a lot. And then in the US, stocks are lower than they were a year ago. Stocks are at multi-year lows right now in the United States. So there isn't the coverage for delays.
You can't get spot coffee right now. And people are estimating that spot coffee will not be a thing. For people who don't understand, spot coffee is like if you were to walk into a supermarket and pull something off a shelf, it's sitting on a shelf. Spot coffee is something sort of similar to that. You can call the green supplier and say, hey,
it's
listen,
what you can get delivered today.
Today, right? You've got access to it, as opposed to buying coffee on contract, forward contracts, where you say, I'm going to secure my supply. You forecast the next 12 to 18 months and forecast the supply that way. Spot coffee is something that smaller roasters count on. So because they just simply don't go through the volumes that require forward contracting. Now, think of it this way. If the spot coffee market goes away, and here in Australia, we're already seeing it. Green suppliers are saying, if you want spot coffee, it's 12 months before you've even got a hope of that coming back. Now, if small roasters, even the larger small roasters, can't get access to spot coffee, what happens?
Yeah.
Their business is fucking
consumption
coffee.
Is going to go down, right? I mean, so then people will say, where's the shortage? Because, the consumption was lost because it's not available.
Yeah. So as we, kind of bring this full circle, how is this going to reflect in the cup with regards to pricing?
Okay, so it depends on the quality of the coffee shop. I mean, remember, there's many different places that are serving coffee. So some of it could be that you're going to see coffee shops using smaller mugs, or hotels, cup sizes shrink. When prices go up, there's actions that are taken to stretch your supply.
Mm-hmm. Shrinkage.
Okay? So, right. So, you have things where the cup is going to, instead of being the 12 ounce, it could be 10 ounce, or where places you go where they top off for free, or, put a pot of coffee on the table. It's not going to happen that way.
Mm-hmm.
Or places that were giving coffee for free, I don't know, a car dealership or something like that. That little perky thing is going to go away. Or maybe in, people's offices, if they're going to offices, right?
Yeah,
then,
that's
right?
a thing of decades ago, isn't it?
and suddenly, put more milk in it, or maybe they'll adapt some of the Indonesian coffees where you actually make these avocado drinks. Put a little more avocado and a little more chocolate and more flavorings, and there's ways to chicory. I mean, there's ways to stretch supply.
That's a word that keeps coming up right now, chicory. People saying, we're not going to go back to the chicory.
The chicory, and that's what happens when prices are high. And then also roasters might kind of try and mask it, with flavorings, and, let's put more whipped cream on, whatever they're doing to try and stretch the supply as much as possible.
Right. And we should also add here, folks, that coffee's not the only thing that's produced in Brazil. It's a highly densely populated commodity grower. It grows a lot of produce, and it wasn't just coffee trees that were affected.
The corn was hurt by the drought.
Yeah.
I mean, that corn was brown when I was there.
Wow.
Last month. I mean, it was damaged from the drought.
Yeah.
And, soybeans will start to be planted soon. That's under irrigation.
Mm-hmm.
And sugarcane was hurt.
Yeah,
I saw by the drought and by the frost.
I saw tomato farms frozen over.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I can't imagine that literal icicles coming off tomato trees. I can't imagine that they'd survive that.
Local market. And there was some citrus that was hurt. Now, here's an interesting one on me, because before you talked about oranges.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the orange juice market actually had risen in price on talk of, and the videos that were coming out of the oranges encased in water and that, they froze.
Okay.
So Brazil hardly ever has frost. And for an orange tree, it's much hardier than a coffee tree.
Mm-hmm.
And so it has to be below 28 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 4 hours. So sub-freezing temperatures for at least 4 hours for hard ice to form inside the orange. You can get some slushy ice, but then you can salvage that fruit and put it through the processor and run it as juice without problem, as long as you get it off the trees quickly enough. And they're in the middle of harvesting right now. So it's not the same as impacting the next year's harvest. Most of the damage to the coffee is to the 22-23 crop, the one that's going to flower. And are the trees going to be able to flower or not? The majority of the 21-22 crop was already picked. Now, whatever was on the tree has some loss in quality. Whatever was drying on the patios also has some quality loss, which most people don't even really talk about. But as far as the orange, here's the interesting part, is that Brazil is a huge consumer of fresh oranges.
Oh, really?
And so if those oranges have some slushy ice in them, they turn to mush, the technical word, right? And therefore they're not going to hold up in the grocery store. You can't sell them as fresh fruit because they're going to go rotten. And therefore, what are you going to do? You're going to process them. So you could actually wind up with increased orange juice supplies because the fresh fruit market is what was hurt the most.
Right. And frozen orange juice is a commodity that's traded, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's what the movie Trading Places was about.
Yeah. What a fascinating conversation. The other interesting part, if we look at the price at the cup level, so what consumers are going to pay for, what people are not quite aware of is we're experiencing a damaging labor shortage in hospitality across the world as a result of the pandemic. On top of that, we've got inflation happening for across the board in the commodities that cafes and restaurants have to use as raw product to create the things that people eat and drink. And so these prices are going to drive your cup of coffee up, whether you're buying it as a bag of roasted coffee or you're buying a cup of brewed coffee. Everything is going up, and yet people are expecting, but it's a cup of coffee. Shouldn't it just cost me 99 cents? And I'm like, look.
No, it's going to go up. And, the cost of the coffee in the cup is really one of the least expensive parts.
Yep.
Because the cost of the stir, the milk, the sugar,
the labor, the rent
of the labor, in cost of goods sold, you're looking at the actual items used to produce that, on the balance sheet, that cup of coffee. So it'd be the stir, the lid, the cup, the cup holder, the napkin, okay, any condiments that are used in it. So if you're using some syrups or cinnamon or, powdered cocoa, that all goes into the cost of the cup of coffee.
Right. But that only takes up about 40%. We've done this many, many times on the Daily Coffee Pro, where we do a cost breakdown analysis of what it actually costs to create a latte. And we recently talked about those numbers on the podcast. And for a $3.50 latte using an 82 scoring specialty grade coffee, when we talked about this at a recent mastermind group that we had, people were giving us astronomical numbers, expecting that I'm making $2 a cup from a $3.50 latte.
Yeah. No.
The net profit, when you take into account all the cost of goods sold, as well as just the big ticket items, rent, labor, just the general cost of running a business, the net profit
There's
on
so many add-ons to that.
There are so many. So many. And people were shocked when we said to them, the very conservative number of net profit from a $3.50 latte is 15 cents. That's what you're walking with.
Now, that's without all the, let's tell you the Panama story, because I had my two shops. Okay. Let's talk about the free cups that were given to people's friends. Let's talk about the free cups that were given to the driver who was waiting to pick up the night staff that I was paying for sending them home late at night instead of taking the public transportation. Okay, so I was paying them an additional, and then the driver is waiting for them, and so every night they're giving free cup to the driver to be nice. And it adds up. When
we say those numbers to people and they're like, but no, look, if I take a kilo of coffee and I divide it up and I this and I that, but you can't do that. You've got to look at your annual profit and loss statement, take what the COGS are from there so that you can account for the free coffees that you're giving away. When we started to do that, we found out that, those 10 loyalty cards where, every time you come in, you get it stamped and then at the end you get one free.
And where your staff double stamps to be nice to their customers.
Right. Yeah. We worked it out on average that every loyalty card that you again, this $3.50 coffee, the net profit from a 10 coffee loyalty card is negative $1.26.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I can believe it.
And people are like, but why are so many people opening cafes? And my response to that is because somebody comes in and says, well, cafes must be profitable because so many people are opening cafes.
Right.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure.
You have to sell other products with it. And this goes back to what the roasters have to do to diversify, because you can't just sell the coffee. You have to sell the muffins. I had frozen yogurt and, 150 toppings with it. And you have to have other products. You have to have some donuts or whatever it might be. You have to maximize your sales per square meter.
But even that, hospitality is being squeezed so bad now. Rene Redzepi posted on his Instagram this past weekend where he did ask us anything. It was him and the staff in his test kitchen. Ask us anything while we're here working on stuff. One of the questions was, how much money does Noma make? And he said, for the past 13 years, we have operated on 3% net profit. Now they have all the extra things. And this is a business that's been voted 3 Michelin stars, best restaurant in the world for many times over. And it's just the simple fact is the general public doesn't understand that,
not just the general public. And this is where
It's
the problem is.
It's the industry as well. Like, just to give people some clarity, 3% net profit and a huge portion of his staff stage. What that means is they come from around the world and they work at Noma for zero financial pay. They get paid in the knowledge and experience that they get from being there. So 3% net profit, and one of his largest costs, which is labor, isn't even being fully realized because he's not paying people. He pays some stuff, but not all of them, right? Now, if he was actually paying for all the labor,
it
he
would be
wouldn't be
$3.50
making
cup of coffee, right? It would be $4.25, $4.50. But so here's the thing I want to mention is that here you have the grower who hears about coffees being sold at $3.75, the $4 cup of coffee. And there's this misconception that one, they're making a ton of money and that there's somehow part of that money can go filter back down the supply chain to them. And that money, as you're saying, doesn't really exist. But not every cup of coffee is selling at that high price.
No.
And they're forgetting all the costs along the way. So there's this huge misconception on the part of producers where, well, we're not getting our fair share. And at the other end, they're seeing how much is being charged for that cup of coffee. And they're forgetting about 18% coming out for roasting even. So when you're
shrinkage.
paying on the shrinkage, okay? And so the producer saying, the math, well, there's, 60 cups out of a pound, and it's not, because they're not counting the shrinkage. They're not counting the loss, and they're not counting all the other ingredients and the cost of the cup or the ambiance and the labor and the difference in the cost of living of what people are making. And it just, there has to be more dialogue. There is someone who I think is a wonderful person and who I really have tremendous respect for in the industry at Sustainable Harvest in Portland, at David Griswold, because this was his model, to have the open dialogue between his roaster clients and the growers, and to talk to them and connect and get them to understand. And this way, the cost analysis was done, and the roasters understood the needs of the producers, and the producers understood some of the challenges that the roasters had, and they're able to work through it together, as opposed to, this continually butting heads and, throwing accusations without really fully understanding the complete picture.
Right.
And that dialogue has to happen a lot more
across the board, because the business model is broken end to end. The people, in 4 years, I have been trying to understand who has been making, like, after 20 years in the industry, the 4 years this podcast has been going, one of my main objectives is to understand who's making money in the coffee value chain. And so far, all I can understand is that it's the banks and the landlords. The landlords from leases and the banks from, right. I mean, people are making money, don't get me wrong, but they're not making the real money. Like, people are surviving off fractions of a cent off a pound.
And people don't understand roaster expenses either. There's the basic shrinkage, but they don't understand, to bring the coffee to the market, how much money is being spent on technology and packaging and the packaging and, safety considerations and all the legal, all the marketing and everything that goes into that. I mean, it's billions of dollars, and it's just not being recognized either. As to why the price is selling for so much to, further upstream, as to what really goes into bringing the coffee to market.
And this is where I want to say to people, if you look at if you listen to this and then you go look at the exchange, and you say, well, but coffee's only at 181 on the C market. Why is my roaster selling it to me for $25 a pound?
Because there's tremendous costs, tremendous costs. And the research and development is astronomical.
When a roaster is selling it to you for $25 a pound, please understand that almost everybody in that value chain is still earning only minimum wage. Everybody across the whole value chain, the person who roasted it, as well as the producers from the other end. Nobody's getting paid well in that value chain. The people who are getting paid well is the landlords that have these leases and the banks that are earning money from loaning people money on the producing end and at the consuming end.
Well, it's going to get much worse now.
Oh, yeah.
Because now suddenly we have high prices because there was some serious damage that was done. I mean, this frost was real. And I'm actually going to make my 4th expedition in a couple of weeks back down to Brazil to see it with my own eyes. I mean, I have to be boots on the ground again. And I've never done this where there's like 4 trips to Brazil to see, to see the crop. But I mean, I have to verify it, you know, and just understand it.
Well, Judy, we wish you a lot of luck. This has been an exceptional conversation. I have really enjoyed this more than I can express.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Wonderful person to have a conversation with about this. Your experience in the industry is just obvious, and your generosity in the way that you express and communicate the thoughts behind stringing everything together is just really wonderful. So thank you.
Oh, with pleasure.
Awesome.
Hope we can do this again. And
I look forward to
when
it.
I come back from Brazil or live from Brazil.
That would be wonderful. I'd definitely be open to that. And hopefully we can have a coffee in person at some point in 355 years when the pandemic's over.
I'm trying to be a little more hopeful than that.
A wee bit. I hope.
Yeah, look, I'm still traveling. If they'll let me in, I can come visit you.
They won't let you in. They're not even letting people who live in other countries out.
But Palau has a flight where you could kind of.
I just won't. Well, let's try it. We could just get on a dinghy and row to have a coffee in the middle of the ocean.
Panama's open, so if you could get out,
that would be a wonderful place to come meet you. I hope one day that happens soon.
It's just you just don't know when you get back in. So we offer laundry service
and amazing coffee because it's Panama.
Yeah, exactly. No one can afford it.
No, right. Well, we look forward to hearing from you when you are in Brazil or after you come back from Brazil and have another conversation with us.
Okay, sounds awesome.
Great. Peace, love, and peanut butter, everybody. Have an amazing rest of your day, and please start paying a reasonable price for a cup of coffee. Bye, everyone.
Bye.